regarding the reduction of urban climate risk. Let's welcome Dr. Winston.
Thank you. Technically, I'm not going to be speaking about Singapore. I'll be speaking on the work that I've been doing as a lead author for the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report for the city's settlement and key infrastructure chapter that was published last year in Working Group 2. So again, afternoon everyone. Firstly, thank you to the organizers for putting me last, because I think what I'm about to say is a nice summary, a nice integrative way of covering what has been covered before by the preceding talks, which are all very excellent, all talk about the important points about resilient development. So I'll focus on that. On Friday, I will be speaking on other IPCC matters. Last month, I was elected as co-chair of Working Group 2 for the IPCC 7th Assessment Report. It's nice to represent this community in my role there. From all the talks that have been presented so far, I am immensely impressed by the very large advances that the scientific community has done in this field. So I look forward to speaking more about that on Friday, particularly with a special report on cities coming due. Right. I like to begin by always saying that what I want to say at the end, the conclusions, in case you forget anything I say. These are the three important points that you should take note. First, we are studying a phenomenon in cities that will get worse over the next 30 years. It will be the focus of many compound and cascading climate risks, which has got the attention of a lot of policymakers. These risks are inadvertent and they arise from the interaction of two complex systems, the climate system and the urban system. Second point is that these climate-driven risks are evolving beyond the three propeller diagram to include the important response component. What the heck does that mean? You'll see that later. It's a theoretical point that we covered in the sixth assessment report pertaining to how policymakers respond to these urban climate risks. And also the worrying thing that they might respond in the wrong way, the idea of maladaptation as opposed to appropriate adaptation. And thirdly, we pose a path forward, which I think this gentleman here you might be interested in terms of putting everything together towards climate resilient development. So you'll probably have questions for me, but I would ask that if you could let others ask first, and I'll have a nice one-on-one conversation with you to that end. Okay. And I did point out a uniquely Singapore case study, but I won't go into too much detail with that. My lab here, the South3 lab, and some other representatives from Singapore will have presented on that, and we can talk about those examples as how it relates to climate resilient development. To begin, very quickly, we all in this room, we all know that when you add the urbanization process, more people living in cities, more functions happening in cities, more capital happening in cities, and you add the broader global and regional climate problem issues together, you get a problem. I live in a part of the world where it has the most densely populated island in the entire world, Java, but we also have several megacities that will increase in size. We have an effective doubling of urban population in Southeast Asia from now until 2050. It's also part of a world where, depending on even the most conservative projections from CMIP 5, CMIP 6, we'll get about 1.7 degrees Celsius warming above the Paris baseline of 1850 to 1900 temperatures. The picture is not going to get any prettier moving forward. So that's the global and regional context. If we zoom into the urban context, there has been some interesting work trying to quantify the relative share of urban versus regional warming for selected cities. This is work done by Rafiq Hamdi, who was a lead author in Working Group 1, and he did a survey of several major cities for their temperature record from 1950, I think looking at 4 or 5 different records from CRU, Berkeley Earth, Hatford 5, the Carlton and Wayset, and also GISTEMP. And I've put in yellow the part of the world where it has seen the most urbanization over the past 50 years in Asia. And there is that working hypothesis that the urban effect, the replacement of natural surfaces with urban surfaces has led to a disproportionate warming from local scale or micro scale processes as opposed to the regional or global. Singapore has about quote unquote 50%. It's not included in this database, and it's something that my good friend Matthias Roth at the back and I have always tried to quantify. Maybe we'll finally get to it to see how much of that warming from this coastal city, whether it matches to the things that we see up there from Thailand, Kolkata, Ho Chi Minh, and so on and so forth. One thing of concern, though, is that while we're pretty good at quantifying the physical exposure, we need to perhaps look into the more social elements that pertain to vulnerability. So, a lot of the rural poverty that has been quantified by various UN bodies is now replaced by urban poverty and rising income inequality. Since the turn of the century, the column charts there have indicated that almost regardless of where you are, the number of people living in the urban poor, in informal settlements, in slums and shanties, they have increased tremendously, primarily in Africa and in East and Southeast Asia. The pictures you see on the right are getting more common. You have the haves and the have-nots in cities. Actions that might reduce the heat island, actions that might reduce urban flooding will most likely in these cases only apply to the haves. All that excess heat or the excess flood, unfortunately, gets shunted to the have-nots. And this is a classic case of maladaptation in which you're not exactly reducing the exposure, you're not exactly solving the problem, you're just kicking it down the road to someplace else, and somebody else will have to deal with that problem. And this is a big concern, as you can guess, for policymakers. In the future, the risks are not exactly climate driven. I mean, you do have the climate impacts of rising temperatures and, as you see, sea level rise in the next slide. But it's also linked to where the most populous cities are located, where the most urban poor are located. This figure is from the technical summary of Working Group 2. It's actually based mainly on the Mora et al. Paper that was published in Nature in 2017, linking where places where there are conditions where there's heat and humidity combined together pose a risk of death. Notice that the tropics are rife with those deadly conditions and also rife with a lot of very dense populated centers. For sea level rise, different climate impact that can drive vast amounts of exposure and drive more vulnerability. The pie chart that you see on the left is absolute population in terms of millions of people. On the right is proportion. Southeast Asia, we've got a lot of people living by the coast, so the raw numbers are large. But if you look in terms of proportions, your small island states in the Pacific, the Australian continent, North America, the Caribbean, and so on, a large proportion of people in those states are also exposed to this climate-driven impact in the future. It can obviously link to a lot of problems. This is when the concept of of compound cascading risks are important. Professor Vida mentioned this yesterday, but I'll talk about how this is important for our policymakers. You've got a climate impact, extreme flood, storm surge. It compounds with an impact on the energy supply, and it then cascades on to transport disruptions, to disruptions in information and communication technology, disruption in important urban services. These compound impacts are there. It will become compound risks in the future if nothing is done. And the worrying thing is that they can oftentimes cascade. So the last picture showed you the impact on social infrastructure. Over time, it becomes chronic. You have got to reduce your budget to transport. You can't maintain your nature-based solutions. People leave because they don't want to live in a place that's climately vulnerable. And then all the urban services get compromised on a lack of tax or lack of revenue from taxes, and it propagates so on and so forth. So this is how urban policymakers realize, hey, in the urban climate science field, we see all these threats. This is now made real. It's going to be a problem in the future. I'll talk about risk, all these things that pertain to the risk factor. In the fifth assessment cycle, risk was this three-bladed propeller of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. Over time, the quantification, the metrics, the indices that Alex was talking about previously, they were added in to try and see what the changes are, how dynamic the hazard, the exposure, or the vulnerability element is. But in the sixth assessment report, we realized, hey, the governmental response, the private sector response needs another blade. So I think I badgered Scott and I badgered Megan to include this propeller in the recent Earth's Futures paper on urban overheating. This is an important element. This has to be quantified if you really want to get into the heart of vulnerability reduction, of successful adaptation. Chow 2 days ago talked about how arrows are important to talk to policymakers to simplify things. In the IPCC, we love these sort of infographics because it tells you a lot of things to policymakers to get their attention. It's the idea of a solution of climate resilient development. It's not just mitigation. It's not just adaptation. It's also biodiversity conservation, and it's also implementing the sustainable development goals. You include all these four things into a framework for development that can apply for national, for state, and municipal levels. We can get to a pathway towards dealing with the climate change problem in cities. And it also reduces the maladaptation risk because you are more inclusive in the decision-making process. We found that to be the case in the assessment of many cities. Here's one example of urban actions towards adaptation applying to climate resilient development. In the columns does this work? Yeah. These columns here, we categorize three different approaches towards urban adaptation: green physical infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and planning and social policy. Far too often, the adaptation focus is on this column here, on green and physical infrastructure. What we find is that if you combine nature-based solutions with appropriate planning and social policy, it's one thing to have good early warning systems that tell you a heat wave is in. You need to marry that with good policies that make sure that whatever limited resources you have in cities can address the risk of, let's say, a heat wave coming in, so that you reduce your vulnerability in that manner. And the important thing is that these solutions, they're not novel, they're not new. They've been there for eons. We've been researching them as a field for the past 20, 30 years. It's just a matter of integrating them in an approach that gives you the best bang for your buck, the best way to reduce climate risk. So the point is that for urban overheating, in this case, for the heat island and all, we focus in on the adaptation component there because that's the short-term risk, that's the immediate response to get things done to reduce urban overheating. And the important thing is that we want to be as inclusive as possible so that maladaptation doesn't occur. You don't miss out on important, vulnerable members of society that will be at greater risk to, for instance, urban overheating or any other urban climate hazard that happens. I will quickly end by pointing out, focusing in on, I wouldn't say that Singapore is a great example of climate resilient development. Other cities have been doing that very well, and you've listened to that earlier on in this session. But in the Singapore context, we try to have that broad, top-down, inclusive approach, focusing in on the sustainable development goals. For instance, the economic sector, making sure that people who might lose out as we move to a green economy, they are reskilled accordingly so that they still maintain their jobs. We focus in on nature, the biodiversity element. We focus in on mitigation in resetting the energy, moving away from non-renewable to renewable sources. And then the adaptation element, where the Cooling Singapore project that several of us have been working on is part of the Singapore Green Plan. So if you have questions about that, ask my lab. They're still around here somewhere. So again, the three takeaways that I pointed out, hopefully I've convinced you all on that as an important element, as a way forward towards good climate design, good climate planning in cities, towards reducing climate risk. And I thank you very much for listening. I want to plug out that I've got a postdoc position open. If anybody wants to work with me in Singapore for the next 2 years, let me know or contact the South Tree Lab from Singapore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zhou. I think that's a very a wonderful chance for some of the students maybe here. Okay, and